So what are we going to talk about over the next 12 weeks? Well, we will talk about Nietzsche's critique of ethics. He doesn't think that ethics is the result of rationally thinking about what makes action coherent, like Kant. He doesn't think that it comes from God because God is dead. He doesn't think that ethics is about maximizing anything. He thinks that ethics is essentially, as we have it now, is the result of a struggle between the strong and the weak. And of course, the strong, and you can think about Homeric heroes, right? You think about Achilles and Agamemnon and those guys. They have a kind of ethics amongst themselves, and the reason Achilles goes for a sulk is that he thought that he'd been that Agamemnon was treating him badly according to the kind of warrior ethics that they live by. But then there's also an ethics among the weak. And what do the weak value? Well, the weak value all sorts of things, but in particular, the weak value virtues and ways of thinking about ethics which discourage the strong from dominating the weak, right? So if you think about the Christian idea that if somebody strikes one cheek, you should turn and offer the other, and the fact that Christianity is generally against cheek striking, but it's also particularly against violent revenge. Well, I mean, that completely destroys the warrior way of life, right? If you can't take violent revenge, how can you be a warrior? How can you even live? Well, you have to live like a weak person. And for the weak, this is great. That, in a nutshell, is Nietzsche's story about how we got to where we are. So he thinks that the morality of the weak is dominant in our society, but we haven't forgotten about the morality of the strong, right? So we understand the idea of taking violent revenge for an offence. We haven't forgotten. But we've also had all this Christian teaching to try and drain it out of us. So Nietzsche tells a story about the emergence of contemporary ethics that's along those lines, and we'll see some of the details later and think about how much of it's true and whether it matters that he should get the history right. I mean, maybe it's essentially a kind of mythopoetic or psychological story where the historical details don't matter, or maybe the whole thing does depend on getting the historical details right in detail. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the will to power as a motive. So quickly, Schopenhauer thought that the basic will is the will to survive, right? There must be a very deep desire to survive because, says Schopenhauer, life is so dreadful. Life is miserable for most creatures most of the time. Most animals live in fear of being eaten by something else or of fear of going hungry. So why would you keep going? Why wouldn't you just lay down and die since life is so miserable? And why would you procreate, right? Bizarre thing to do given how dreadful life is. So, says Schopenhauer, there just must be a drive to life that drives you both to sustain your own life and to procreate. Well, says Nietzsche, that can't be the whole story because people do dangerous things that don't help them procreate, like people fight battles, people take risks. Why do they do that? Well, says Nietzsche, because there's a fundamental drive for power, a will to power, or in humans, a will to a feeling of power. And that allows Nietzsche to insist that this is an explanation for more or less everything that human beings do. So we'll look at what exactly he means by that and whether it's true. Eternal recurrence is another Nietzschean theme. So that's the idea that if your life was replayed infinitely often, right? So every time your life came to an end, it was replayed, so that anything bad that you did got redone. You'd never get to say, well, that's in the past. I can get over it. No, because it's going to happen again and again and again and again for all time. How would you feel about your life then? Would you be able to cope with that thought? Well, Nietzsche thought that this was a kind of deep test of our attitudes towards our lives. And it's a deep test in the context of Schopenhauer's description of what life is like, right? So can you say yes to your life if it's as miserable and pointless as Schopenhauer thought? Self-creation and self-overcoming. That's another theme. So one of the complaints Nietzsche had, Nietzsche didn't like the society in which he lived. He would have liked our society even less. And he didn't like the kind of factory culture. He complained that most people are factory products. Most people say the sorts of things and think the sorts of things and do the sorts of things, wear the sorts of things, eat the sorts of things, exactly that one would expect of a person of that time and place. Why? Because we're basically factory products, and we stay that way because we're lazy. But if we want to, we have the option of trying to become who we really are, right? So sometimes Nietzsche talks about creation, sometimes he talks about discovery, but there's the idea that there's a better you available. If you're willing to do the work and take the risks necessary to find out who that person could be, and then to try and become that person. And that means that for Nietzsche, there are certain kinds of virtues. So although Nietzsche is an immoralist in the sense that he doesn't think much of morality as taught in school or in church, or for that matter in a synagogue or the mosque, it doesn't mean that he thinks there are no values. There are things that he cares about. He has values that he cherishes. He just thinks that our society isn't terribly good at valuing them. And he calls for a revaluation of values. Partly it would be a matter of recovering some of the heroic virtues, but he doesn't want us to become exactly like the heroes in Homer. He doesn't want us to become like Achilles and Agamemnon and all those guys. Why? Because they were kind of stupid. And they didn't produce art. They stole art that other people made. They were basically pirates. And, there's only limited kind of greatness in that. So he was interested in virtues and in perfectionism. Now, perfectionism isn't the philosophy that you should try and become perfect. Rather, it's the idea that you are called to work on yourself. That, and this may sound a bit Christian, and if it does sound a bit Christian, well, remember what we said about Nietzsche's dad being a clergyman, and actually Nietzsche did an awful lot of theology as a student. So it's not that surprising if this if the great atheist who announced that God is dead sometimes sounds a bit like there's still a fair amount of kind of Christian habits of thought sticking to him. This was something that he said about other people. So one of his complaints is that there are atheists who think that they've thrown off Christian thinking altogether, but actually it's still shaping their thoughts, even if they aren't going to church and talking about God anymore. He's quite rude about George Eliot on this front. Well, one thing to remember about Nietzsche is that if he says something aggressive about other people, it's usually because he's found it in himself, right? The reason he's such a confident vivisectionist of other people's psychological failings is because ultimately he's talking about himself. And the last thing I want to mention is the value of truth, right? Nietzsche says nobody's ever really thought about whether truth is good for us, right? So people say the truth will set you free. The truth will set you free, but will it? And will you be better off? Will you live better? Will you be healthier? And there's some experimental evidence to suggest that people with mild depression actually have a clearer understanding of what the world's like. In fact, most people, and certainly psychologically healthy people, are excessively optimistic about their own futures. They expect their lives to go well, which statistically can't be entirely right. The number of people who expect their lives to go well is rather greater than the number of people whose lives eventually do go well. Most people overestimate how popular they are with the society in which they move, and so on, right? So if you have an accurate understanding of your place in the world and what your life's going to be like and all the rest of it, then you're probably not very optimistic, and you may be mildly depressed. So turn that around. What does psychological good health mean? What does flourishing mean? Well, it may mean excessive optimism or unrealistic optimism on all sorts of fronts, and a kind of unwarranted cheerfulness. Now, Nietzsche was in favour of cheerfulness, but he was also in favour of intellectual honesty. So the great challenge for our age, for Nietzsche, or one of them, was how to be cheerful without lying to yourself. Is that possible? Right? That'll be one of our themes. And finally, I'll talk a bit about Max Weber. So Max Weber was a German sociologist, kind of a generation or two after Nietzsche, and took Nietzsche very seriously, and I think took up Nietzsche's questions in an interesting way.